Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. I'm John, and today we have another lesson from cEDH. cEDH is a metagame within the Commander format that sits at one extreme with highly consistent, highly efficient decks. Not all cards are equally powerful in all formats, or even in all metagames, but there are lessons to be learned from how players are using some of the most powerful cards in Magic's history. And this one is from way back in cEDH history, back before Dockside was even a thing. But before we head back in time, let me take a moment to thank you for joining us here on Commander Cookout Media Group. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube, and be sure to check out the sponsors, FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all your gaming needs. And there's Duskmourn out now. Foundations is coming out in a few weeks at this point. By the time this comes out, it shouldn't be out quite yet, at least I don't think so. I'll be honest, it's hard to keep track of all the release dates these days. But the point is, if you want to save some money, you might as well use the promo codes which are on the screen and in the description of this episode. That's FusionGamingOnline.com, your source for all your gaming needs. Now, with Dockside having been banned out of the format, one of the premier outs to mana denial strategies is gone. And to be fair, Stax is probably still in a bit of a tricky spot at the moment. You have to pick the right proactive answer to play with imperfect information. Certainly not impossible, as many successful Stax players have proven over the years, but it's also definitely more difficult than just trying to jam a win through. Mana Denial is a little bit different than a lot of traditional Stax effects in that it clamps off the resource that almost every single action in the game depends on. Classic Mana Denial comes in the form of cards like Winter Orb, which limit the number of lands which our opponents can untap. This is all well and good, but in cEDH, usually the emphasis is more on the rocks that you've cast than the lands that you have played, which is why so much is happening on turns 2, 3, and 4 of a cEDH game. This is why during the reign of Dockside, most of the successful mana denial strategies targeted artifacts, and they were usually on cards like Collector Oof, Null Rod, or Stony Silence, all of which turned off the activated abilities of artifacts. If we look at mana denial in other formats, we see cards in decks like Death and Taxes and Legacy, using Stax effects like Thalia, Garden of Thraben, to increase the cost of all non-creature spells by 1. The trick is that you need to be able to break parity on these mana denial strategies. So Death and Taxes does this by playing lots of little creatures that it can just swing in with while the opponents are slowed down by a full turn. Look at decks like Yasharn, Selesnya deck that runs Collector Oof, Null Rod, Stony Silence, cards we talked about a couple of moments ago. It chooses to eschew mana rocks as a source of ramp, relying on mana dork, so again it can break parity. The mono blue version of Urza breaks parity on cards like Winter Orb by tapping them for mana and avoiding the negative effects of the card on their own turn. Today, in what I hope is going to be a shorter episode, we're going to look at one of my personal favorite mana denial strategies in the form of Blue Moon. Blue Moon is usually Izzet, or at least base Izzet, combining the mana denial effects of red and blue in a way that is particularly backbreaking. Stopping lands or artifacts from untapping, or increasing the cost of spells can really slow decks in a cEDH game down by a lot, where razor-thin margins are needed to operate. Blue Moon is a strategy of mana denial that works just a little bit differently, primarily using cards like Blood Moon to achieve its effect. Blood Moon is 2 in a red for an enchantment with non-basic lands or mountains. Not just mountains in addition to their other types. They stop being whatever they were, they lose all of their abilities, and their type line is land, mountain. This means they tap for a red, and that's it. If it was a fetch land? Good news, it's a mountain. It can't be sacrificed to go get something else. cEDH is a metagame with perfect mana fixing, and we talked about fetch lands into duels and shocks a few weeks ago, which makes 4 and 5 color decks very painless to play. And the reason Blood Moon fell out of favor was because even though there were all these 4 and 5 color decks running around, you really only needed red mana to cast Dockside Extortionist. And Treasures, unaffected by Blood Moon, provided both a ramp to get out from under mana denial as well as fixing. Fixing allowing you to convert Dockside Treasures into an Ad Nauseam, or an Underworld Breach, or even a Thassa's Oracle. Basically, you turned that red mana into any color you wanted. And ask anybody who's played any serious Storm deck, being able to convert mana from one color to another is often a very key piece of the puzzle to solve. Dockside was really the only rituals provided both ramp and fixing in that case. And to listen to people talk, the only card left casting in red these days is Underworld Breach. I think that's a little bit of an overstatement, but hey, if we're going to go along with the metagame, we might as well take advantage of this. Traditionally, Blood Moon was also paired with its creature counterpart, Magus of the Moon. In this case, it is 2 and a red for a 2/2 creature wizard with the same text as Blood Moon. Blue Moon added blue to the mix to not only protect its Stax effects, but with the additional redundancy of cards like Back to Basics. 2 and a blue for an enchantment with non-basic lands don't untap during their controller's untap steps. I was introduced to this strategy in a Laboratory Maniacs video that came out just a little while ago. Or 7 years ago. Anyway, the Blue Moon form of Mana Denial got a little boost recently from Modern Horizons 3, adding Harbinger of the Seas, a 2/2 creature, a merfolk wizard for 1 blue with non-basic lands or islands. So you get some nice redundancy. It's a lot easier to find that beefier package and get your game plan online and slow your opponents down. But if you try to play out both Harbinger of the Seas and a Blood Moon, does that mean that every land your opponents control is now a volcanic island? You know, what I'd like to do in a situation like this is just call a judge.
Judge Cotton here again for another great question. Blood Moon and the new Harbinger of the Seas, the bane of anyone who plays a greedy mana base. But what happens if we have both in the field? Do we have a mountain? Do we have an island? Or do we just have the volcanic island at home? Well, let's break these cards down. To start with, we'd like to note that both of these cards are replacement effects. Rule 614.12. These both change non-basic lands into a basic land type, each a mountain or an island. Also of note, these aren't an addition to their other types. So how do we know which one if they are both out? Well, layers. As both are type changing effects, they are applied in layer 4, 613.1d. From there, we look at the timestamp order, 613.7, meaning which one of these was first and which one was put out last. Once we are able to determine which card had entered the battlefield most recently, that will determine what all the non-basics are.
Hey, thanks for stepping in with that one. I really appreciate it. So where can people find you?
You can find me on a multiple of Discords, predominantly on the CCO Discord, where I also edit gameplay footage. There are casual games of CCO Patreons battling out with their favorite janky decks. The latest one was just released a couple weeks ago. The next one will be out November 7th. This gameplay will make any entrenched Magic players scream with excitement as they watch the most amazing raw dog decks go at.
Thanks again. Now, the trick in a Blue Moon deck is to have a way to break parity on some of that mana denial in some reasonable way, as locking down the board in a metagame as interactive as cEDH is, that can be tricky. So let's look at 2 decks I've been brewing recently to try to look into the Blue Moon style. The first is an attempt to revisit one of my earliest cEDH brews, Malcolm Kediss. In this case, the partner pairing is meant to try to break parity on mana denial by making 3 treasures a turn. As Kediss is 1 and a red for a legendary creature Elemental Lizard, a 1/1 with partner, and whenever a commander creature you control deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to each other opponent. This triggered ability works really well with Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator, 2 and a blue for a legendary creature Siren Pirate, a 2/2 with partner, flying, and whenever 1 or more pirates you control deal damage to your opponents, not combat damage, you create a treasure token for each opponent dealt damage. And it's Malcolm's triggered ability lacking that combat damage restriction that allows Malcolm to combo with cards like Glinthorn Buccaneer. 1 red for a Minotaur Pirate, a 2/4 with haste. Whenever you discard a card, Glinthorn Buccaneer deals 1 damage to each opponent, and 1 and a red, discard a card, draw a card. Activate only if Glinthorn Buccaneer is attacking. This means that if we attack with Glinthorn Buccaneer, we are able to, if we control Malcolm, pay 1 and a red, discard a card, have Glinthorn Buccaneer deal 1 damage to each opponent, generating 3 treasures. Then we are up a treasure when we spend 2 of them to activate Glinthorn Buccaneer to repeat the process. So unless we are very low on cards or opponents have very mismatched life totals, it's a 2-card combo that wins the game. In fact, I focused on it exclusively in my original version of Malcolm Kediss, which focused on Polymorph. The more common build of Malcolm Kediss back in the day was more mid-range, using the deep roster of powerful creatures, like Dockside Extortionist, to fuel the deck to draw into Glinthorn combo naturally. In this version of the deck, the Blue Moon, We're running our full Blue Moon package, as well as other powerful cards from Modern Horizons 3 like Volatile Storm Drake, a second Gilded Drake effect, in addition to Winter Moon to add to the density of mana control. Getting 3 treasures each combat step lets us break parity on the mana denial pretty easily, so we can grind out value with traditional engines like Rhystic Study while still holding up interaction. And in this version of the deck, I'm running just about every 2 mana value creature who can get us a couple extra cards per round of the table as possible. I'm still working on the rest of the deck list, and honestly, the deck back when I was running it just as the polymorph version had a pretty easy time both developing and holding up mana to interact with just how much mana Malcolm generated. In the version I'm working on, I am looking at including creature type changing effects, like the new Leyline of Transformation from Duskmourn, to potentially open up lines of turning pingers into pirates, and running Shao Jun from Assassin's Creed as a combo engine, and as a value engine who not only breaks parity on Winter Orb and Winter Moon by tapping them for damage, but it can also combo with Malcolm if turned into a pirate with Leyline, as you're going to be able to deal 1 damage to each opponent, generate 3 treasures, which you could then tap for activating the ability again, and another way to potentially win the game. The list still definitely needs some work. At the moment, I have also included Niv Mizzet Perun in the list as a curve topper value engine, which also works really well with the Curiosity effects, which seem to be good with all the pingers. And just take a look at the full deck list in the description. Give me some feedback on it. I think there's some real potential here. I've had a lot of success with Malcolm Kediss before, and I think the slower version of the deck is something that's very viable. Now, the other deck that I'm experimenting with is an Izzet version of Vhal Candlekeep Researcher. I took an Azorius version of this deck to a top 16 finish at a tournament in 2022, but this Izzet version is going to do the Blue Moon thing, using the commander to break parity on the Mana Denial package. Vhal is 3 and a blue for a 2/3 legendary creature human wizard with vigilance, choose a background, and tap. Add an amount of colorless mana equal to Vhal's toughness. This mana can't be spent to cast spells from your hand. We're going to get around that restriction of not casting cards from our hand with the background Tavern Brawler. 2 and a red for a legendary enchantment background with commander creatures you own have. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. This creature gets +X/+O till end of turn, where X is the card's mana value. You may play that card this turn. We're really not super interested in pumping up Vhal's power. Honestly, we'd be happier if it increased her toughness instead, but it's still a very useful way to see additional cards. We're going to borrow some of the technology from other Izzet decks like Aruth Tormented Prophet and Prosper Tomebound, as playing cards from exile is not playing cards from our hand. There's also the technology to potentially look at with something like Conspiracy Theorists and playing cards from exile after we loot into them. And obviously, being in Izzet, we have lots of access to looters, some of whom have fallen out of favor over the years. I'm also experimenting with Valley Floodcaller as a potential combo piece in the deck. 2 and a blue for a 2/2 Otter Wizard with Flash, and you may cast non-creature spells as though they had Flash, which already raised a lot of eyebrows in cEDH for being a Flash enabler, but also does a nice impression of Jeskai Ascendancy with its triggered ability. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, birds, frogs, otters, and rats you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Untap them. This combos with a 0 mana rock and a card like Banishing Knack or Retraction Helix, instance which lets you give a creature until end of turn. Target creature gains tap, return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. So we would take something like Mox Amber, tap it for mana of some color that we need, tap Valley Floodcaller to return it to our hand with Banishing Knack, play it again to untap Valley Floodcaller, tap it for mana, and we can generate unbounded colored mana in this way. I did experiment with some other future sight effects before, and they may be the right call here. But at the moment, I'm leaning more into the impulse draw side of things. Yeah, it stinks to exile interaction, but I think there's a lot of potential from red in this case for this deck. So I've got some other decks that I'm working on at this point, and I'm sure I'll get around to those soon. But for now, I'm going to bring this episode to a bit of an early close. I do hope you enjoyed it, but my usual recording time kind of got eaten up. Recently, we had some weather in Florida. Let's leave it at that. If you did enjoy this episode, you can always let us know about it in the comments on YouTube, where we are part of Commander Cookout Media Group. You can add us on Twitter, where we are at GemstoneMineMTG, or you can send us an email. gemstoneminepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm John, and this is Gemstone Mine.